Vanessa had always been the picture of perfection. At 28, she had everything anyone could want: beauty, a loving husband, a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and a promising career that was beginning to take off. She was the type of woman everyone admired. Her long, dark hair, flawless skin, and striking green eyes made her unforgettable. When she met Jared in college, she was immediately drawn to his charm. He had an easy smile, an infectious laugh, and a way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. They met at a party during their sophomore year, and from the moment their eyes locked, it was as if time had slowed. He walked over with a confident smile, and they immediately hit it off. She had never been the type to fall for someone so quickly, but Jared was different. His wit and humor made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed before, and his energy felt contagious. They spent the night talking, and by the end of the evening, they exchanged numbers. The connection was instant and undeniable. Over the next few months, they became inseparable. They went on late-night walks through the city, stayed up until the early hours of the morning, sharing their hopes and dreams. It wasn't long before Jared asked her to be his girlfriend, and Vanessa, overwhelmed with joy, agreed. Their relationship felt destined, as though they had been written into each other's lives long before they even met. After 4 years of dating, Jared proposed during a weekend getaway in the mountains. It was a fairy tale moment. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves as Jared knelt down on one knee. "Vanessa, I love you more than words can say. Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. Vanessa was stunned. She had always imagined this moment in her head, but it was even more magical than she had dreamed. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. Yes, of course. Their wedding was everything they had envisioned: an elegant affair held in a picturesque garden. The flowers were in full bloom, the sky painted in hues of pink and gold, and their friends and family surrounded them. It was perfect. They exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. Everything seemed perfect. They were the ideal couple, the envy of everyone who knew them. Their love story was one for the books. At first, life was bliss. The newlyweds settled into a rhythm of daily life, balancing their careers with the love they had for one another. Jared was climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious marketing firm, and Vanessa was quickly gaining recognition in the marketing world as well. She had been promoted to a senior position just 6 months after they got married, and it seemed like everything was falling into place. They had a charming house, weekends filled with adventure, and plans to start a family. The world was theirs to conquer. But as time passed, the initial excitement began to fade. They were no longer the same carefree couple who had spent late nights talking about their dreams. Instead, their conversations became about bills, work stress, and how they could manage the pressures of adult life. The spark that once lit their relationship seemed to have burned out. Vanessa noticed it first. Jared, who had always been so attentive, had started to withdraw. He came home later and later, his mind consumed by work. When he did come home, he would sit on the couch, distracted by his phone or laptop, barely acknowledging her presence. His once affectionate gestures had turned into obligatory pecks on the cheek. He was still a good husband, but the intensity of their relationship had faded. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just a phase. After all, they had been married for a few years, and things couldn't always be as exciting as they had been at the beginning. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She longed for the excitement, the passion, the feeling of being desired. Jared, despite his many qualities, no longer made her feel that way. Her frustration grew, and she found herself questioning everything. Was this what marriage was supposed to feel like? Was this what she had signed up for? The thoughts spiraled, and she began to feel disconnected from her husband. The woman she had been before marriage, full of confidence, ambition, and excitement, was now buried under a layer of routine and discontent. She began to fantasize about what it would be like to feel that spark again. To be desired, to be pursued. She told herself it was just a passing thought, but as days turned into weeks, the longing only grew stronger. She didn't want to hurt Jared, but she couldn't ignore the aching void inside of her. It wasn't long before Vanessa found herself noticing other men. Not in any serious way, but she couldn't help but compare them to Jared. Every time she saw someone who made her heart race, she felt guilty, but also exhilarated. The feeling was intoxicating. It reminded her of what she had once felt with Jared. Vanessa tried to push these feelings aside, but they kept bubbling to the surface. It wasn't that she didn't love Jared anymore, she did. But something had changed. He was no longer the man who made her heart skip a beat. She couldn't ignore the fact that the passion that had once defined their relationship had vanished. And so, when she found herself alone one rainy evening, she made a decision. She needed a distraction, something to pull her out of the emotional fog she was trapped in. She grabbed her phone and opened the ride-sharing app. A momentary escape, that's all it was. She wasn't looking for anything serious. Just a change of scenery, a break from the routine. When the car pulled up, she didn't think much of it. But the moment the door opened, her pulse quickened. The driver, Damien, was different. He was taller than most drivers, with dark, brooding eyes that seemed to look right through her. His voice was deep, calming, with an edge of mystery that intrigued her immediately. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, their conversation flowed easily. She found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with Jared in months. He asked questions, listened intently, and made her laugh. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt seen, heard, and appreciated. Vanessa found herself taking more and more rides with Damien over the next few weeks. What had started as a simple escape from the routine of her marriage had evolved into something more. She knew she shouldn't be spending so much time with him, but each ride felt like a breath of fresh air, a departure from the dull monotony of her life. Damien was a mystery, someone who didn't know her past or the life she had with Jared. For once, she could be someone else. She didn't have to be the perfect wife or the successful career woman. With Damien, she could be vulnerable, unguarded. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, she stepped into Damien's car with a sense of relief. The weather was colder now, and the streets were illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. She could feel the weight of the day lifting as they drove through the familiar route. They talked about everything and nothing at all, the weather, the latest movies, music, but with every passing mile, Vanessa felt a sense of connection that she hadn't felt in ages. "Are you sure you're okay?" Damien asked, his voice warm with concern. Vanessa glanced over at him, surprised. "What do you mean? You just seem distant lately." "Like something's on your mind," he said, his eyes meeting hers briefly in the rearview mirror. She hesitated. Should she tell him? It wasn't like she owed him any explanations, but for some reason, the desire to confide in him was overwhelming. Her marriage, her struggles, the emptiness she felt, all of it seemed too much to keep bottled up any longer. "I guess. I just feel like I'm losing myself," she admitted quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm married, I have a career, but I don't feel like I'm happy." "Not really." Damien remained silent for a moment, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly. "Everyone does." Vanessa swallowed hard. The words struck a chord in her heart. She hadn't realized how desperately she had been searching for validation, for someone to acknowledge the emptiness she had been carrying around. It wasn't just about the lack of excitement in her marriage, it was about the disconnection from herself, the feeling that she had become a stranger to her own desires and dreams. They reached her house a few minutes later, but the moment felt heavy. Vanessa's hand lingered on the door handle, unwilling to break the fragile connection they had built. As she turned to thank him, Damien caught her gaze and, without thinking, leaned in. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as though both of them were waiting for the other to pull away. But neither did. Vanessa's heart raced in her chest, the anticipation, the longing, overwhelming her senses. She had kissed Jared 1,000 times before, but this kiss felt different. It felt forbidden, thrilling, dangerous. When they pulled away, Vanessa's mind was spinning. What had she just done? She hadn't planned for this. She had always been the good wife, the responsible woman who never let herself slip. But in that moment, she had crossed a line. And now, there was no going back. I should go," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew one thing: she couldn't deny the chemistry between them any longer. Damian didn't say anything at first, just nodded as she got out of the car. "Take care, Vanessa," he said, his voice low and filled with something she couldn't quite place. As she walked into her house, the air felt thick with tension. Jared was in the living room, his laptop open in front of him, completely unaware of what had just transpired. Vanessa stood there for a moment, feeling like a stranger in her own home. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her, but it also lit a spark inside her, a spark she hadn't felt in so long. The next few days were a blur. Vanessa found herself distracted at work, her mind replaying the kiss over and over again. She felt guilty, torn between her love for Jared and the new, intoxicating connection she had with Damian. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, heard his voice, felt the heat of his touch. It was a drug, and she was addicted. But the guilt lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was betraying Jared, even though she hadn't technically done anything wrong. She hadn't slept with Damian, hadn't crossed that final line. But the emotional betrayal felt just as real, just as painful. In the days that followed, Vanessa found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Her once clear thoughts were now clouded by doubt and desire. She loved Jared, she truly did. But Damian had unlocked something within her that she hadn't even known was there. The connection they shared was electric, charged with a rawness that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She found herself thinking about him constantly, counting the minutes until she could take another ride, hoping for another fleeting moment of closeness. But every time she saw Jared, that nagging guilt would creep back in. She couldn't help but wonder if Jared could sense the change in her, if he could feel the distance growing between them. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Jared mentioned something about his upcoming business trip. "I'll be gone for a few days," he said, looking at his phone. "Work stuff. I know you've got a lot on your plate, but I thought we could do something when I get back. Maybe dinner at that new place you like?" Vanessa nodded absently, her mind drifting elsewhere. She hadn't even heard what he had said, her thoughts consumed by Damian. "Vanessa?" Jared's voice snapped her back to the present. "You okay? You seem a little out of it lately." She forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Yeah, just tired," she replied, though she knew it was more than that. She was weary, but not from work. She was exhausted from the inner turmoil, from the constant battle between her love for Jared and the allure of Damian. The next morning, as Jared packed for his trip, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads. She had always prided herself on being a good wife, a loyal partner. But the temptation was growing stronger, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could resist. As Jared kissed her goodbye and left for the airport, Vanessa stood in the doorway, staring out at the empty driveway. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone, and yet, for the first time in a long while, she also felt free. Vanessa's days began to blur into each other, filled with conflicting emotions that left her feeling like a stranger in her own skin. She missed Jared, she truly did, but the connection she had with Damian was undeniable, a fiery thread that tugged at her, pulling her further from the life she had built with her husband. The morning after Jared left for his business trip, Vanessa felt a strange sense of freedom. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that settled heavily on her chest, making her feel as though she were walking through a fog. She went about her routine, though everything seemed different. There was a heightened awareness in her movements, a sense that things were shifting, that she was on the cusp of something that could change everything. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a text from Damian. "Hey, I know you're probably busy, but I was thinking about you. I know we shouldn't be doing this, but I can't help it. I need to see you again." The words hit her like a spark, igniting a fire within her that she hadn't felt in months. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, her heart racing. She knew she should ignore it. She knew she should focus on her marriage, on the life she had with Jared. But she couldn't deny the pull of temptation. She replied quickly, her thumb typing the words before she could stop herself. "I'll be free later. Just don't tell me to stop." It wasn't just the rush of desire that drove her to send that message, it was the feeling of control, of reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost in the shuffle of everyday life. With Damien, she wasn't just Vanessa, the wife, the professional woman. She was someone else, someone alive, someone who could make her own choices, regardless of the consequences. A few hours later, she was sitting in Damien's car, the familiar hum of the engine filling the space between them as they drove through the streets of the city. The tension was palpable, an undercurrent of something dangerous, exciting. When Damien turned to her, his eyes dark with anticipation, she could feel the air around them thicken. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low and serious. "But I can't keep pretending that we're just friends. I want more. I've wanted more for a long time." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. She had been teetering on the edge of something for days, weeks even, and now she was standing at the precipice. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she met his gaze. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Without another word, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was more intense than anything they had shared before. This time, there was no hesitation. This time, there was no pulling away. As their bodies pressed together, the world outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the heat of the moment, the stolen time that belonged entirely to them. But even as her body responded to him, a nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. What was she doing? Was this just a fleeting desire, something she could walk away from, or was it the beginning of something far more dangerous? For a moment, she tried to push the thought aside, letting herself be swept up in the sensation, in the intoxicating mix of guilt and exhilaration. But deep down, she knew she was crossing a line, and once crossed, there was no going back. Vanessa awoke the next morning in Damien's bed, the sheets tangled around her, the faint scent of him still lingering in the air. For a long moment, she simply lay there, staring up at the ceiling, her mind spinning. The events of the night before felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't shake off. She had known what she was doing, and yet now that it was over, she wasn't sure what to feel. There was a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread swirling inside her. She quickly dressed and slipped out of the apartment, trying to ignore the rising panic that began to settle in her chest. She had done something irrevocable, something that couldn't be undone. As she drove back to her house, her thoughts were in turmoil. Jared would be home in a few days. He had no idea what had happened, no idea what she had done. The weight of her actions felt crushing, but there was also an undeniable sense of freedom. For the first time in months, she felt alive, as though she had taken control of her own fate. But the question lingered, had she gone too far? Could she live with the consequences of her choices? When she arrived home, everything seemed normal. The house was still empty, Jared's luggage left neatly by the door, waiting for his return. The house, which once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed hollow, a reminder of the life she had chosen to betray. Vanessa stood in the hallway, frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Should she confess? Should she come clean to Jared, lay everything out on the table and let him decide what happened next? But as the hours ticked by, she found herself avoiding the thought. The fear of facing Jared's disappointment, the fear of losing him, was too much to bear. So she buried her guilt, swallowed her doubts, and tried to push forward as though nothing had changed. But deep down, she knew that everything had changed. The delicate balance of her marriage was shattered, and there was no going back to the way things were. She had crossed a line, and now she had to live with the consequences, no matter how painful they might be. Part 7, The Weight of Secrets, 7. Days turned into weeks, and life continued on as if nothing had changed. Jared came home from his business trip, and they resumed their usual routine. But Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that everything was different. The air between them felt charged, like an invisible thread that connected them, yet at the same time, kept them apart. Jared didn't ask questions. He was his usual self, kind, attentive, and loving, but Vanessa knew that something had shifted within her. The guilt gnawed at her every time he smiled, every time he kissed her on the forehead before leaving for work. She wanted to believe that she could go back to the way things were, that she could bury the secret and move on, but every glance at Jared reminded her of what she had done. Her mind kept drifting to Damien. The stolen moments, the passion, the connection that felt so real, so raw. It was as if she were living in two separate worlds now, one where she was the perfect wife to Jared, and one where she was a woman caught in the web of temptation and desire. Each time she saw Damien, she felt the pull, the magnetic force that drew her to him, even as the weight of her betrayal grew heavier. But the hardest part wasn't the guilt or the fear of being caught. The hardest part was knowing that, despite everything, she wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. She had crossed a line, but now she was left wondering if she could find her way back. And deep down, she knew she might never be able to. The days dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Vanessa had hoped that time would ease the guilt gnawing at her, but it only seemed to intensify. Every moment spent with Jared felt like a lie, every smile she forced felt like a betrayal. She had once been so sure of her love for him, so certain of the life they had built together. But now, every time she looked at him, the weight of her secret threatened to crush her. It wasn't just the guilt anymore, it was the overwhelming desire for something more. Something that Jared couldn't give her, something she had found in Damien. The thought of him, of their time together, lingered in her mind constantly, a constant pull she couldn't resist. Damien's touch, his words, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years, it was a drug she couldn't quit, and every time she saw him, it became harder to walk away. One evening, as she sat in her living room, watching Jared work on his laptop, Vanessa's mind wandered again. Her fingers hovered over her phone, and before she could stop herself, she found herself texting Damien. "I need to see you. I can't stop thinking about you." The words felt like an admission of something she had been avoiding, something she couldn't hide any longer. She pressed send, and before long, the familiar buzz of a reply echoed in her hand. "I've been thinking about you too. I'll pick you up in an hour." The next hour felt like a lifetime. Vanessa couldn't focus on anything but the impending meeting with Damien. The guilt was still there, sharp and cutting, but it was overshadowed by the raw longing that had taken root deep within her. When Jared kissed her goodbye, his lips warm against her forehead, she couldn't help but feel a pang of something. Was this wrong? Was she really going to betray him again? But as soon as the door closed behind him, she felt the floodgates open. Her mind no longer questioned what she was about to do. It had ceased to matter. She had become so consumed by the desire to feel wanted, to feel alive again, that she had lost sight of everything else. The drive to Damien's place felt like a blur. Vanessa's mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions that she couldn't quite untangle. She had made the choice. She had crossed the line once again. The pull of Damien was too strong to ignore, and the anticipation that built within her made her heart race faster than the car on the road. When Damien's car finally came to a stop in front of his building, Vanessa hesitated for a moment. The apartment complex looked the same as it always had, a place that had once felt like a forbidden oasis. But now, it felt like a prison, one of her own making. The realization hit her like a wave. She was drowning in this affair, in the lies, in the deceit. She had become someone she no longer recognized. Damien was already waiting for her at the door. His presence, as usual, was magnetic. He smiled at her, his eyes dark with anticipation, but there was a new intensity in his gaze, something that made Vanessa's stomach flutter. As soon as she stepped inside, the familiar warmth of his apartment enveloped her. The lights were dim, the air thick with the tension of what was about to unfold. "Vanessa," his voice was low, his hand reaching out to her, pulling her closer. "Are you sure about this?" She met his gaze, feeling the weight of the question settle between them. Was she sure? A part of her wanted to say no, wanted to pull away, to run back to the life she knew with Jared. But she couldn't. She had already crossed that line. There was no turning back now. "I'm sure," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, though she didn't fully understand why. Was it fear? Excitement? A strange mixture of both? Damien didn't say anything more. He simply kissed her, his lips demanding and urgent, as though he knew she needed to be swept up in the moment, to forget everything else for just a little while. And for a moment, she did. She let go. She didn't think about Jared, or the life she was ruining. She only thought about the heat of Damien's touch, the overwhelming desire that consumed her every time he was near. But as the moments passed, as the reality of what they were doing set in, Vanessa felt a strange emptiness grow inside her. She had wanted this. She had desired it with every part of her being. But now that it was happening again, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something important, something she might never get back. Vanessa woke up the next morning in Damien's bed, the light streaming in through the window casting long shadows across the room. Her body ached from the night before, the evidence of her choices still fresh. For a long moment, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. She had crossed a line. Again. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Jared. "Hey, I'm home earlier than expected. Want to grab lunch?" Vanessa's heart dropped into her stomach. She had completely forgotten about Jared's return. The guilt hit her like a ton of bricks, but it wasn't just the guilt anymore. It was the overwhelming sense that she had shattered something within herself, something she could never fix. She quickly typed a response, her fingers trembling as she fought to maintain control. "I'm just finishing up some work, but I'll be home later. We can grab dinner?" She hit send before she could think about it too much, then slipped out of Damien's bed, her heart heavy with the realization that she was living a double life. The woman she had been before this affair, the loyal wife, the loving partner, seemed like a distant memory now, one that she could never return to. As she dressed and left Damien's apartment, the weight of her decisions followed her, pressing down on her shoulders. She was no longer sure who she was anymore. The choices she had made, the lines she had crossed, had left her feeling fractured, lost. What was the price of her desires? Was it worth it? As she drove back to her house, Vanessa couldn't help but feel that she was at a breaking point. Something had to give. The walls she had built between herself and the reality of her situation were crumbling. She could feel the tension building inside her, a storm that was about to break. But the question lingered, would she be able to put the pieces of her life back together? Or had she already gone too far? The days following her latest encounter with Damien felt like a blur. Vanessa moved through them on autopilot, her mind consumed by the consequences of her actions. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but each time she thought about stopping, about confronting the truth, she felt paralyzed by fear. Fear of losing Jared. Fear of being exposed. But also fear of what it meant to stop seeing Damien, to let go of the one thing that made her feel alive. Her marriage with Jared had always been steady, predictable, almost too much so. But now, everything had shifted. The facade of normalcy felt suffocating. She could feel the cracks beginning to show, the strain between them, even though Jared remained oblivious to her secret. His concern for her, his affection, his hopes for their future, they all felt like chains that kept her locked in a life she no longer recognized. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to tell him. To confess everything. To reveal the person she had become. One evening, after dinner, Jared was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, while Vanessa paced restlessly in the kitchen. The silence between them was thick, pregnant with unspoken words. As she prepared dinner, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Damien. "I can't stop thinking about you. We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow." Vanessa's heart pounded. She knew what this meant. Damien was getting closer to her, his grip tightening. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. But the fear of facing Jared's wrath, of losing everything, pushed her further into the web she had already woven. She couldn't bring herself to reply immediately. Instead, she slipped the phone into her pocket, trying to focus on preparing dinner. But the thought of Damien, of the passion he stirred in her, wouldn't leave her mind. The desire was overwhelming, a constant pull she couldn't ignore. Jared, noticing her distant behavior, set the magazine down and turned to face her. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but tinged with concern. "You've been quiet all evening." Vanessa froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She forced a smile, hiding the truth behind it. "Yeah, just tired," she lied, wiping her hands on a towel. "It's been a long week." But Jared wasn't convinced. He stood up and walked over to her, his brow furrowed. "You sure? You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" For a moment, Vanessa considered telling him. Telling him everything. About Damien. About her feelings. But the thought of hurting him, of shattering everything they had built, was too much. She couldn't bear it. "I'm fine, Jared." "Really?" she said, her voice too calm. He studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "Okay, if you say so." But Vanessa knew that this moment, this fleeting moment of normalcy, was just a mask. It was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. The next day, Vanessa stood in front of Damien's apartment, her heart racing. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, torn between her desire for him and the guilt that threatened to swallow her whole. She knew she had to face him, the truth, the consequences, everything. When Damien opened the door, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. There was a tension in the air, one that Vanessa couldn't ignore. She had made her choice, but she wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. "I've been thinking about us," Damien said, his voice low, intense. "What we're doing, it's dangerous. But I can't stop wanting you, Vanessa." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. She had always known this would happen, but hearing the words made the reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. "I know," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "I've been thinking about it too. And I don't know what to do." Damien moved closer, his hand reaching for her, and she didn't pull away. There was something magnetic about him, something that kept pulling her in, no matter how much she tried to resist. "We can't keep pretending this isn't real," Damien said, his voice tinged with both frustration and longing. "I don't want to be the other man anymore." Vanessa's heart broke at the words. She knew that, deep down, Damien was right. This was no longer just an affair. This was a relationship, messy, complicated, and full of consequences. "I can't leave him, Damien," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "I don't know if I can do that. I love him." Damien's expression hardened, and for a moment, Vanessa thought she saw something like anger flash across his face. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by a sad acceptance. "I understand," he said softly. "But I can't keep doing this if you're not going to choose me." The finality in his words hit Vanessa like a slap to the face. She had been living in a state of denial, hoping that everything could remain a secret, that nothing would change. But now, everything had changed. "You need to choose, Vanessa," Damien said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You can't have both." Vanessa stood there, her heart torn in two. She had reached the tipping point, the moment where the decisions she made would determine the rest of her life. Would she choose the life she had with Jared, the man she had promised to love and cherish? Or would she throw it all away for the passion and excitement Damien offered? Vanessa spent the next few days in a haze, unable to focus on anything other than the choices that lay before her. She had always thought she could have it all, the stability of her marriage with Jared and the thrill of the affair with Damien. But now, she realized, she couldn't. The cost of living this double life had become too high. Something had to give. She knew what she had to do, even though the thought of it terrified her. She had to face Jared. She had to tell him the truth, even if it meant losing him forever. That evening, as Jared returned home, Vanessa knew the time had come. She had tried to prepare herself for this moment, but no amount of preparation could make it any easier. "Jared, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. Jared looked up, concern flashing in his eyes. "What's going on?" "I've been lying to you," she whispered, her heart pounding. "I've been having an affair with Damien." The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa could hardly breathe as she watched Jared's face transform, his expression a mix of shock, hurt, and disbelief. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Tears filled Vanessa's eyes as she realized the enormity of what she had done. "I don't know. I got lost, Jared. I didn't know what I wanted anymore." Jared stood there for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. Vanessa's heart shattered as she watched him leave, knowing that she had just destroyed the one thing that had ever truly mattered to her. The days that followed were a blur of emotion, regret, and pain. Jared moved out, and Vanessa found herself alone in the house that had once felt like a home. The silence was unbearable, the weight of her actions suffocating. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. Damien continued to reach out to her, but Vanessa knew that nothing could fix what had been broken. She had lost both men, the stability of her marriage and the thrill of the affair. The woman she had been was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable, someone lost in the aftermath of her own choices. And as she sat in the empty house, the reality of what she had done sank in. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back.